The helicopter's rotor blades sliced through the humid air as it descended toward the small clearing. Dr. Sarah Wells pressed her face against the window, studying the massive volcano that dominated the horizon. Ash particles drifted past like gray snowflakes, coating the lush jungle canopy below. "Seismic readings have tripled in the last month," she said, more to herself than to her companions. "Something's definitely changing down there." The chopper touched down with a jolt that sent equipment cases sliding across the floor. Sarah unbuckled her harness and stood, her muscles stiff from the long flight. Clara gathered her medical supplies, methodically checking each case. "How long has this station been abandoned?" she asked, tucking a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. 6 months, Sarah replied. "The previous team left when funding dried up. Lucky for us, the university got spooked by these new readings." Jack snorted as he hefted his toolbox. "Yeah, real lucky. Sent to babysit a mountain that might blow its top." "This mountain hasn't blown its top in over 50 years, Leo interjected. He stepped from the helicopter with practiced ease, his weathered face betraying no concern. "My father saw the last eruption. This one has different patterns." Sarah led the group toward the cluster of prefabricated buildings that comprised the research station. Vegetation had already begun reclaiming the site. Vines crawled up walls, and small creatures scattered at their approach. "We'll need to get the generators running first," Sarah said, scanning the compound. "Then communications. I want seismic monitors placed by nightfall." Jack kicked at an overgrown path. "Place is a mess. Gonna take days just to make it functional." "We have 12 hours before I need readings," Sarah replied, her tone leaving no room for debate. Leo paused, his head tilted slightly. The others fell silent as a low rumble vibrated through the soles of their boots. It lasted only seconds, but the message was clear. "That's the third one today," Leo said quietly, "more frequent than last week." Clara exchanged a worried glance with Jack. "Is that normal?" Sarah unfolded a map across a dusty table just inside the main building. "That's what we're here to find out." Sarah wiped sweat from her brow as she calibrated the last seismic monitor. The afternoon heat pressed down on the station like a physical weight, intensifying the smell of damp earth and vegetation. She checked her watch. They'd been working for 6 hours straight. "Main power grid is back online," Jack called from the utility shed. Lights flickered to life across the compound, and the gentle hum of air conditioning units broke the jungle silence. Sarah nodded her approval. "Good work. Let's get the data systems up next." Inside the main lab, Clara had finished organizing her medical supplies and was helping Leo unpack the scientific equipment. She handled each delicate instrument with the same care she'd give to a patient. "The last team left in a hurry," Leo remarked, brushing dust from a seismograph. "They didn't even properly seal the storage containers." Sarah connected her laptop to the station's main computer. "The university said it was budget cuts, but something doesn't add up." She frowned at the screen as data began to flow. They had funding secured for another year at least. The floor trembled beneath them, stronger than before. A coffee mug slid across the table and shattered on the floor. "That's the 5th one today," Clara said, her voice steady despite the concern in her eyes. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the readings from the monitors she'd just placed. "The pattern is changing. These aren't regular tremors. They're getting stronger and closer together." Jack entered the lab, wiping grease from his hands. "Communications array is shot. Something fried the circuits. Might have been lightning, might have been—" "Sabotage?" Leo finished, his expression grave. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Sarah said, though the possibility had already crossed her mind. "The satellite phone still works. We can request replacement parts." Another tremor shook the building, lasting longer than the previous ones. dust sifted down from the ceiling. Leo moved to the window, staring at the volcano's silhouette against the darkening sky. There's something you should know about the previous team. They didn't leave because of budget cuts. Sarah turned from her computer. What do you mean? They left because they were afraid. The locals have stories about this mountain. When it wakes up, it doesn't just bring ash and lava. Sarah squinted through the sulphurous haze that clung to the volcano's inner slope. The team had been climbing for 3 hours, their path growing steeper and more treacherous with each step. Sweat plastered her dark hair to her forehead, despite the cool morning air. "Watch your footing here," Leo called back, extending a hand to help her over a particularly jagged outcropping. "The rock is unstable." Sarah's handheld seismograph beeped softly, drawing her attention away from the precarious terrain. The readings had been steadily increasing all morning, but this was different, a sudden spike that made her heart skip. "Everyone stop," she ordered, studying the device with growing concern. "These readings don't make sense." Jack paused his ascent, breathing heavily as he leaned against his walking stick. "What's wrong?" "The pattern's changing. It's like..." Sarah frowned at the screen. "It's like there are 2 distinct sources of seismic activity." Clara joined her, peering over her shoulder at the readings. Could it be an equipment malfunction? 3 separate devices showing the same anomaly? Not likely. Sarah pointed toward a narrow fissure in the crater wall about 50 meters ahead. "I want to check that out." As they approached the opening, a wave of heat struck them, carrying with it an unfamiliar odor. Not the typical sulfur smell of volcanic gases, but something metallic and strange. "I've never encountered this gas composition before," Sarah said, checking her atmospheric analyzer. "The helium-3 levels are off the charts." Leo's weathered face creased with concern. "In all my years guiding scientists up this mountain, I've never seen the crater like this." Sarah approached the fissure, which was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Her analyzer beeped frantically as she directed its sensor into the darkness. "There's a cavern system in there," she said, shining her flashlight into the gap. The beam revealed smooth, almost polished walls that couldn't have been formed by natural volcanic processes. "This doesn't look natural." Another tremor shook the ground beneath them, stronger than any they'd felt before. Small rocks tumbled down the crater walls. "We should go back," Jack urged. "Whatever's in there can wait until we have proper equipment." But Sarah was already slipping through the fissure, drawn by scientific curiosity and the promise of discovery. The narrow passage opened suddenly into a vast chamber that her flashlight couldn't fully illuminate. The walls glittered with embedded crystals that seemed to pulse with an internal light. "This is impossible," she whispered, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This chamber should be filled with magma." Sarah's flashlight beam danced across the crystalline formations, revealing geometric patterns that defied natural explanation. The chamber hummed with energy she could feel through the soles of her boots. Her scientific mind raced to categorize what she was seeing, but nothing in her extensive education had prepared her for this. "Sarah," Clara's voice echoed from the narrow entrance. "You need to come back. It's not safe." "You all need to see this," Sarah called back, unable to tear her eyes from the pulsing crystals. They seemed almost alive, responding to her presence with subtle shifts in luminescence. Jack squeezed through the opening next, his engineer's eye immediately assessing the structure. "This isn't volcanic," he muttered, running his hand along one smooth wall. "These surfaces are machined, not formed." Leo followed, his weathered face illuminated by the strange glow. He remained silent, but Sarah noticed his expression. Not surprise, but grim confirmation. "You knew about this," she said, turning to face him. "This is why the last team left, isn't it?" Before Leo could answer, Clara slipped into the chamber, her medical kit clutched tightly against her chest. Her eyes widened as she took in the impossible space. "The locals call it the heart," Leo finally said, his voice low. "They believe the volcano is alive, not just active, but conscious. These chambers are its veins." Sarah's analyzer beeped frantically, registering energy patterns that made no scientific sense. "That's mythology, not geology," she replied automatically, though her conviction wavered as she watched the crystals pulse in rhythm like a massive heartbeat. The ground beneath them shuddered, more violently than before. Dust and small rocks rained from the ceiling. "We need to leave," Jack insisted, already moving toward the exit. "Whatever this is, we're not equipped to study it now." Sarah hesitated, torn between scientific curiosity and the growing sense of danger. Another tremor decided for her, this one strong enough to knock Clara off balance. Sarah caught her arm, steadying her colleague. "He's right," Sarah conceded. "We'll come back with proper equipment and a larger team." As they made their way back toward the narrow fissure, Sarah felt a strange reluctance, as if the chamber itself was pulling her back. The crystals pulsed brighter as she approached the exit, almost in protest. Sarah was halfway through the fissure when the mountain roared. The sound came from everywhere at once, a deep, primal bellow that vibrated through her bones. The narrow passage constricted around her as the walls shuddered. "Move!" Jack shouted from behind. She scrambled forward, emerging into the crater just as a massive tremor knocked her off her feet. The sky above had darkened to an apocalyptic red. Ash clouds billowed upward, illuminated from within by flashes of volcanic lightning. "It's erupting!" she yelled, pulling Clara through the opening. "Leo, Jack, hurry!" The two men squeezed through seconds before the fissure collapsed in a shower of rocks. They stood frozen for a moment, watching as the crater transformed around them. Fissures spiderwebbed across the ground, venting superheated steam. In the distance, their research station, a collection of prefabricated buildings perched on the crater's edge, listed dangerously as the ground beneath it gave way. "The equipment!" Sarah gasped. "All our data!" "Forget the data!" Jack grabbed her arm. "We need to get out of here now." They sprinted towards the path that led down the volcano's flank, but a fountain of lava burst from the ground ahead, cutting off their escape. The heat struck them like a physical blow, forcing them back toward the center of the crater. "The comms equipment was in the station," Clara shouted over the volcanic roar. "We can't call for help." Leo scanned the crater walls, his experienced eyes searching for a way out. "The old lava tubes might still be intact on the north side. They could lead us to the coast." "Through the mountain?" Clara's voice cracked with disbelief. "It's either that or wait to be cooked," Jack said grimly. Another violent tremor knocked them to the ground. The research station collapsed entirely, sliding into a newly formed chasm. Their only link to the outside world was gone. Sarah stared at the strange fissure they'd just escaped from. The crystals inside glowed brighter now, visible even from where they stood. "The tubes Leo mentioned," she said, her scientific mind racing despite the danger. "They might connect to that chamber system we found." Leo led them across the unstable crater floor, navigating around steam vents and widening cracks. Every few seconds, the ground shuddered beneath their feet. Sarah kept her eyes on the north wall, where Leo had indicated the ancient lava tubes might provide escape. "The tubes formed during earlier eruptions," Leo explained, his voice barely audible above the volcano's rumbling. "They can remain intact for centuries." Sarah stumbled as another tremor rippled through the ground. Jack caught her arm, steadying her. His face was streaked with ash, eyes wide with controlled fear. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The reality of their situation was sinking in. trapped inside an erupting volcano with no communications and their only exit blocked by a river of molten rock. Clara pointed toward a dark recess in the crater wall ahead. "Is that it?" "Yes," Leo confirmed. "One of the main tube entrances." They approached cautiously. The opening was larger than Sarah had expected, roughly 10 feet high and twice as wide. Cool air flowed from its depths, a stark contrast to the infernal heat surrounding them. "The tubes branch throughout the mountain," Leo said, peering into the darkness. "If we can find the right path, we should reach the northern slope." "And if we take the wrong path?" Clara asked. Leo didn't answer. A deafening crack split the air as a massive section of the crater rim collapsed, sending boulders tumbling down. The avalanche missed them by mere yards, but the message was clear. Staying in the open was suicide. "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, pulling out her headlamp. "Let's go." The tube's interior was surprisingly smooth, its walls glazed by ancient flows of lava. Their headlamps cast eerie shadows as they moved deeper into the mountain's heart. The rumbling of the eruption became muffled, more felt than heard. "The chamber we discovered earlier," Sarah said, her scientific curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. "Could it connect to these tubes?" "Possibly," Leo replied. "These systems are complex, formed over thousands of years of volcanic activity." Jack tapped his flashlight against the tunnel wall. "Is it just me, or is it getting warmer?" Sarah felt the ground vibrate beneath her feet as they ventured deeper into the lava tube. Each tremor sent a fresh wave of panic through her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving. The tunnel narrowed in places, forcing them to squeeze through tight passages where the heat pressed against their skin like a physical weight. "Watch your step," Leo called back, his voice echoing against the smooth, volcanic glass walls. "The ground isn't stable." The air grew thicker with each passing minute. Sarah pulled her shirt collar over her nose, but it did little to filter out the sulfurous fumes that burned her lungs. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes and blurring her vision. "We need to rest," Clara said, her medical training evident in her concern. She leaned against the tunnel wall, breathing heavily. "Just for a minute." Jack shook his head. "Can't stop. Not here." He pointed to a thin crack running along the ceiling where a reddish glow seeped through. "That's magma up there." Leo nodded grimly. "The whole system is becoming active. These tubes could fill with lava or collapse at any moment." Another violent tremor shook the passage, stronger than the ones before. Small rocks rained down from above, pinging off their helmets. Sarah stumbled forward, catching herself against the hot wall. The rock seared her palm, and she jerked back with a hiss of pain. Clara was at her side instantly, examining the burn. "Second degree. I've got something for that." She dug through her pack with shaking hands, producing a small first aid kit. "Save it," Sarah insisted. "I'm fine." The ground beneath them gave a low, ominous groan. The sound reverberated through the tunnel, setting Sarah's teeth on edge. "We're directly above a magma chamber," she realized, her volcanologist's training cutting through her fear. "The pressure is building." Leo pointed to where the tunnel forked ahead. "Left branch should take us toward the northern slope. Right one goes deeper." Sarah hesitated at the fork, her mind racing through the limited options. The decision felt impossibly heavy, left toward potential safety, or right into the unknown depths. Another tremor decided for her. "Left," she commanded, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We need to get to the northern slope." They hurried down the left passage, hunched over as the ceiling dropped lower. The tunnel walls glowed an eerie orange red, illuminating their path with hellish light. Sarah's burned palm throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Jack stumbled, catching himself against the wall before lurching forward. "This is insane. We should have had warning signs, precursors, something." His voice cracked. "I checked all the equipment myself." "Not now, Jack." Leo led them around a sharp bend where the tunnel widened into a small chamber. "We need to—" The ground beneath them lurched violently. A deafening crack split the air as a fissure opened in the chamber floor, venting scalding steam that filled the space within seconds. "Move!" Sarah shouted, pushing Clara ahead of her toward the tunnel's continuation. The steam clouded their vision, turning the world white and burning their exposed skin. Clara coughed violently, her medical pack clutched against her chest. I can't see." Leo grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "Stay together, follow my voice." They stumbled through the steam, the heat unbearable. Sarah's lungs burned with each breath. She counted steps in her head, focusing on the simple rhythm to keep panic at bay. One foot in front of the other. Survival depended on movement. The tunnel began to slope upward, and the steam thinned. Sarah allowed herself a moment of hope. Then the ground shook again, this time with such force that they were all thrown against the walls. "The whole system is destabilizing," Sarah gasped, helping Jack to his feet. "We need to move faster." Leo pointed ahead, where a faint glow of different quality filtered down. "Natural light. There's an opening." Sarah squinted at the faded parchment in her hands, using her headlamp to illuminate the ancient markings. The map had been tucked away in a small alcove they'd passed, protected from the elements in a sealed clay container. She traced the winding passages with her finger, trying to match them to their surroundings. "This shows a way out through the northern chamber," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "If we follow this passage, it should lead us to a vertical shaft that reaches the surface." Jack paced back and forth, his boots scuffing against the volcanic rock. "Ancient maps? Are you serious? That thing could be centuries old. The whole tunnel system has probably changed a dozen times since then." "It's the best lead we have," Sarah insisted, rolling the brittle paper carefully and tucking it into her pack. Clara placed a steadying hand on Jack's shoulder. "Deep breaths, Jack. Your heart rate's too high." She guided him to sit on a relatively flat rock and checked the bandage on his forearm, where a falling stone had gashed him earlier. "We're going to die down here," he muttered, wincing as Clara applied antiseptic to a fresh cut on his temple. "The whole place is coming apart." Leo crouched near the tunnel entrance, studying the ground. The ancients knew this volcano better than anyone. If they mapped an exit, it's likely still there. He stood, brushing dust from his hands. "But Jack's right about one thing, these tunnels are becoming unstable." As if to emphasize his point, a tremor shook the chamber, dislodging a shower of pebbles from the ceiling. Sarah instinctively covered her head. "We need to keep moving," Leo urged, adjusting his pack. "This way." He led them into a narrow passage that sloped downward. Sarah hesitated, comparing it to the map. "Wait. According to this, we should be heading up, not down." Leo shook his head. "Trust me, the passages loop back. This is the only safe route. The upper tunnel collapsed in the last quake." Sarah felt torn between the ancient knowledge in her hands and Leo's experience. Another tremor made the decision for her as cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling of the upper passage. "Fine. Lead on." As they descended deeper, the air grew hotter and more sulfurous. Clara distributed the last of their water, her medical supplies dwindling with each minor injury she treated. "Everyone stay close," Leo called back, his voice barely audible over the rumbling that now seemed constant. "The next chamber should connect to the vertical shaft." The passage narrowed further, forcing them to proceed single file. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on Leo's back, trying to ignore the way the walls seemed to pulse with heat. Her burned palm throbbed beneath Clara's hasty bandage, but she pushed the pain aside. The ancient map crinkled in her pocket, a tenuous lifeline she wasn't sure she could trust. "This doesn't match what I remember," Leo muttered, pausing at an intersection where 3 tunnels branched off. He wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of ash across his forehead. The tremors must have changed the layout. Sarah felt a flutter of panic. "What do you mean? You said you knew these tunnels." "I do, but—" Leo's words cut short as the ground shifted beneath them. Not a violent tremor this time, but a slow, sickening tilt. Clara grabbed Sarah's arm to steady herself. "The floor's subsiding." Jack let out a strangled laugh. "Great! Now the damn volcano's swallowing us whole." Sarah pulled out her flashlight, directing the beam down each tunnel in turn. The left passage sloped sharply downward, disappearing into darkness. The middle one seemed to curve away almost immediately. The right passage inclined upward, their best chance to reach the surface. "Right tunnel," she decided, pointing. "We need to gain elevation." Leo hesitated. "I don't think—" A deafening crack interrupted him as a fissure opened in the floor between them and the left passage. Molten rock bubbled up through the gap, casting an orange glow across their faces. "Right tunnel it is," Leo conceded, leading them forward. The incline grew steeper as they climbed. Sarah's legs burned with the effort, her lungs struggling to pull oxygen from the thin, toxic air. Behind her, Clara helped Jack navigate a particularly treacherous section where the floor had partially collapsed. "There's a chamber ahead," Leo called back, his voice echoing strangely. They emerged into a vast cavern where stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone daggers. The far wall featured a vertical crack that extended upward beyond the reach of their lights. A faint breeze, cooler than the stifling air they'd been breathing, whispered down from above. "The shaft," Sarah breathed, hope flaring in her chest for the first time in hours. "Leo, is this it?" Jack stared at the vertical shaft, his face contorting in disbelief. "You expect us to climb that?" His voice bounced off the cavern walls, amplifying his fear. "It's got to be 30 feet straight up." Sarah examined the crevice, running her fingers along the rough volcanic rock. "There are enough handholds. We can make it." "Like you knew we could make it through those tunnels?" Jack's laugh was brittle. "Face it, Sarah. Your precious map is useless. We're just wandering blind down here." Sarah felt a flash of anger, but forced herself to remain calm. "The map got us this far." "This far? We're trapped in the heart of an erupting volcano." Jack paced in tight circles, his breathing rapid and shallow. "For all we know, the surface is already covered in lava. We could be climbing into a death trap." Leo stepped between them. "Keep your voice down. Sound carries in these chambers." "Why? Afraid the volcano will hear us?" Jack's voice cracked. He pointed an accusatory finger at Sarah. "She dragged us down here on some scientific wild goose chase, and now we're all going to die because of it." Clara approached Jack slowly, hands raised in a calming gesture. "You need to breathe, Jack. The panic isn't helping." "Don't tell me what I need." He jerked away from her touch. "What I need is to get out of here, not follow some ancient scribbles deeper into this hellhole." Sarah felt the group's unity fracturing with each word. The pressure of leadership weighed on her shoulders like stone. "We stick together," she said firmly. "That's our only chance." "Like we have a choice?" Jack kicked at a loose rock, sending it skittering across the floor. "I should have stayed at the station. I told you the readings were off, but no one listened." A violent tremor shook the cavern, dislodging small stones from above. They all instinctively huddled together, their argument momentarily forgotten. When the shaking subsided, Jack's face had paled to ash. "It's getting worse. We're running out of time." "Then help us instead of fighting," Sarah pleaded, trying to bridge the growing divide. "We need your skills, Jack. I can't do this alone." Jack stared at her, conflict evident in his eyes. Fear battled with his sense of duty. For a moment, Sarah thought he might refuse. "Fine," he finally muttered. "But if that shaft doesn't lead out, I'm done following your lead." Sarah stared up at the vertical shaft, calculating their chances. The rock face offered natural handholds, but the climb would be treacherous, especially with their depleted energy and injuries. "I'll go first," Leo said, adjusting his pack to sit tighter against his back. "Test the route." He approached the wall and began to climb, fingers finding invisible crevices in the volcanic rock. Sarah watched anxiously as he ascended, each movement deliberate and precise. 10 feet up, he paused to rest, bracing himself against a small ledge. "It's stable enough," he called down. "Follow my path exactly." Clara went next, her medical pack secured across her chest. Though clearly exhausted, she moved with surprising agility, mimicking Leo's route. Sarah motioned for Jack to follow. "You next," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Jack hesitated, fear evident in his eyes, but he stepped forward and began to climb. His movements were less confident than the others, his breathing labored. Halfway up, his foot slipped, sending a shower of loose rock cascading down. Sarah dodged the falling debris, her heart hammering. "Steady," Leo called from above. "There's a good handhold to your right." Jack found it, steadying himself with visible effort. Sarah could see his arms trembling from exertion. When Jack had climbed far enough, Sarah approached the wall. Her burned palm protested as she gripped the first handhold, but she pushed through the pain. Each upward movement was a small victory against gravity and exhaustion. 20 feet up, the shaft narrowed, forcing them to press their bodies against the cool rock. Sarah felt claustrophobia threatening to overwhelm her, but she focused on Leo's boots just above her head. "Almost there," Leo called down. "I can feel a stronger breeze." The final 10 feet were the hardest. Sarah's muscles screamed in protest, her fingers bloody from the sharp volcanic rock. Just as her strength began to fail, Leo's voice rang out with renewed hope. "I see daylight." The daylight Leo had glimpsed turned out to be merely a cruel illusion, a phosphorescent mineral vein that had tricked their desperate eyes. Their path continued deeper, the tunnels growing hotter with each step forward. Sarah felt her hope wavering as sweat streamed down her face, stinging her eyes and soaking her already filthy clothes. "We need to rest," Clara said, her medical training asserting itself as she checked Jack's worsening leg. "Just 5 minutes." Sarah wanted to protest. Time was their enemy, but the exhaustion etched on everyone's faces told her pushing further without a break might break them completely. 5 minutes, she agreed. They had barely settled when the tunnel ahead brightened with an unnatural glow. Sarah exchanged glances with Leo, whose eyes widened in recognition. "The heart," he whispered. "We've reached the heart of Kilauea." The narrow passage opened suddenly into an enormous cavern that stole what little breath Sarah had left. Magma flowed in lazy rivers around the chamber's perimeter, casting everything in a hellish red-orange light. Heat radiated from the walls in visible waves, making the air shimmer and dance. Despite the flowing lava, the chamber possessed an unnatural stillness, as if they'd stepped into a moment frozen in time. "My God," Sarah murmured, professional curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. "The pressure here should be catastrophic, but it's contained." Jack limped forward, his pain seemingly forgotten as he stared at the spectacle. "It's like a cathedral," he said, his voice hushed with reluctant awe. Clara's medical supplies clattered to the ground as she sank to her knees, overwhelmed by the sight. "How is this possible? We should be dead from the heat alone." Leo alone seemed unsurprised. His face, illuminated by the magma's glow, looked ancient and knowing. The elders spoke of this place, where fire meets spirit, where the volcano breathes. Sarah felt something shift in the air, not a physical change, but something deeper. The constant tremors that had followed them through the tunnels ceased completely. In their place came a profound silence that pressed against her eardrums. "Something's wrong," she whispered, though she couldn't articulate what. "This isn't natural." The magma pools pulsed once, twice, like a massive heartbeat. Sarah took a cautious step forward, drawn by scientific curiosity despite every instinct screaming for retreat. The chamber's unnatural stillness pressed against her skin like a physical weight. "We shouldn't be here," Jack hissed, his voice cracking. He leaned heavily against the wall, leg trembling beneath him. "This place, it feels alive." The magma pulsed again, stronger this time. Sarah felt the vibration through the soles of her boots. The rhythmic movement sent shadows dancing across the cavern walls, creating illusions of movement where there was none. Leo moved to the edge of one magma pool, his face transformed by the orange glow. "The stories say this chamber is the volcano's consciousness, that it chooses who passes through." "That's mythology, not geology," Sarah countered, but her scientific certainty wavered as another pulse rippled through the chamber. Clara finished rebandaging Jack's leg with shaking hands. "Mythology or not, we need to find a way out before we collapse from dehydration." She wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of ash across her forehead. "The heat is unbearable." As if responding to her words, a narrow pathway appeared across the chamber, a stone bridge that seemed to solidify from the very air, spanning across the largest magma pool toward a dark opening on the far side. "That wasn't there before," Jack whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah stared at the impossible bridge, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "It must have been obscured by the heat distortion." "No," Leo said simply. "It wasn't there. Now it is." He stepped toward the bridge with reverent confidence. "The volcano has decided." Another pulse shook the chamber, stronger than before. Small stones tumbled from the ceiling, splashing into the magma pools. The rhythm increased, the pulses coming faster. "It's destabilizing," Sarah realized, watching as cracks appeared along the chamber walls. "Whatever this place is, it's reacting to our presence." Leo turned back to them, his expression grave. "We cross now, or we die here." Sarah hesitated at the bridge's edge, her scientific mind still grappling with the impossibility before her. The stone pathway seemed both ancient and newly formed, stretching across the churning magma below. She reached out to touch it, expecting her hand to pass through an illusion, but her fingers met solid rock, unnaturally cool despite the infernal heat surrounding them. "We don't have a choice," she said, more to herself than the others. Leo stepped onto the bridge first, his movements careful but confident. The structure held firm beneath his weight. He extended his hand back toward the group. "One at a time. Stay centered." Clara helped Jack to his feet, her medical training evident in how she positioned herself to support his injured leg. "I'll be right behind you," she promised, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Jack's face had gone pale beneath the layer of ash and sweat. "I can't," he started, but another violent pulse cut him off. A section of the cavern wall collapsed, sending a shower of rocks into the nearest magma pool. The resulting splash of molten rock missed them by inches. "You can," Clara insisted, her grip on his arm tightening. "One step at a time." Jack swallowed hard and nodded, his terror momentarily overcome by the more immediate danger of staying put. He limped onto the bridge, following Leo's careful path. Sarah watched them advance, then turned to Clara. "You next." Clara shook her head. "You go, I'll follow." The chamber pulsed again, faster now, like a heart racing toward cardiac arrest. The bridge trembled but held. Sarah knew there was no time to argue. She stepped onto the stone pathway, fighting the vertigo that threatened to overwhelm her as she glanced down at the magma flowing beneath her feet. The heat was suffocating, yet the bridge remained cool. Sarah focused on Leo's back ahead of her, on Jack's labored breathing, on anything but the impossible physics of their situation. Her scientific training had never prepared her for this, a place where geology and mythology seemed to blur into one indistinguishable truth. Halfway across, the bridge widened slightly. Leo paused, waiting for the others to catch up. His face was solemn in the orange glow, eyes reflecting the dancing flames below. "The volcano speaks," he said quietly. "Can you hear it?" Sarah strained to hear whatever Leo was referring to, but all she could make out was the bubbling of magma and the distant rumble of the volcano above them. The bridge trembled again, more violently this time. "We need to keep moving," she urged. They pressed forward, each step a test of will against the growing instability of the chamber. When they finally reached the far side, Sarah felt momentary relief wash over her until she saw what waited beyond. The dark opening they'd spotted from across the chamber wasn't an exit at all, but another passage, this one lined with strange angular markings that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The tunnel sloped downward, not up toward escape. "This can't be right," Jack said, desperation edging into his voice. "We're supposed to be finding a way out, not going deeper." Before Sarah could respond, Clara gasped behind them. "Look!" The markings on the walls had begun to glow brighter, illuminating the passage ahead. The light traveled downward, as if inviting them to follow. "It's showing us the way," Leo whispered. Sarah hesitated, torn between scientific skepticism and their desperate need for guidance. "Let's follow it, carefully." The passage twisted sharply downward, then leveled out after about 30 meters. The air here felt different, cooler, with a strange electric quality that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand on end. The glow from the markings intensified, revealing a chamber ahead that none of their maps had indicated. As they stepped inside, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows above. But what dominated the space were the crystals, hundreds of them jutting from the walls and floor in perfect geometric patterns. Each crystal pulsed with an internal light that shifted through colors, deep blue to violet to a white so pure it hurt to look at directly. "What is this place?" Clara whispered, her medical training momentarily forgotten as she stared in wonder. Sarah approached the nearest crystal formation, her scientific curiosity overwhelming caution. The crystal's surface was smooth and cool to the touch, despite the volcanic heat that should have permeated everything at this depth. "These aren't natural formations," she said, examining the precise angles and placements. "They've been cultivated, positioned with purpose." Leo moved deeper into the chamber, stopping before a wall covered in the same angular markings they'd seen in the tunnel. "These are old, older than any language my people remember, but they speak of harnessing the volcano's heart." Sarah joined him, studying the intricate patterns. Among the abstract symbols were unmistakable depictions of human figures, their hands raised toward stylized representations of the crystals. This was deliberate, she realized, An ancient civilization. They weren't just surviving near the volcano, they were using it somehow. Jack staggered backward, his injured leg nearly giving way beneath him. Using it? For what? His voice echoed against the crystal formations, distorting into something almost unrecognizable. Sarah traced her fingers over the engravings, her mind racing to connect what she was seeing with her scientific understanding. Energy, perhaps, or communication. The markings seemed to respond to her touch, glowing brighter where her fingertips passed. Clara knelt beside a cluster of smaller crystals, her medical training drawing her attention to their rhythmic pulsing. They're synchronized, she observed, counting the intervals between pulses. Like a heartbeat, Leo moved to the center of the chamber, where a circular platform stood elevated above the floor. Unlike the rest of the chamber, this structure was made of polished obsidian that reflected the crystal light in hypnotic patterns. The elders spoke of a place where our ancestors communed with the mountain spirit, he said, his voice hushed with reverence. I always thought it was just a story. Sarah joined him at the platform, her scientific skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence before her. The obsidian surface was inscribed with concentric circles and radial lines that converged at the center, a design that reminded her of astronomical charts. This is impossible, she whispered, more to herself than the others. Volcanic activity should have destroyed anything this delicate centuries ago. As if responding to her words, the crystals pulsed in unison, bathing the chamber in blinding light. The ground beneath them trembled, but differently than before. Not the violent shaking of an eruption, but a steady vibration that seemed to resonate through their bodies. The platform beneath Sarah's feet began to glow, lines of light tracing the inscribed patterns until the entire design blazed like molten silver. She felt a strange pressure building in her ears, a sensation of movement despite standing still. Something's happening, she warned, backing away from the platform. We need to... Her words died as the chamber around them shifted, the walls seeming to become transparent. Beyond them, Sarah could see the entire network of tunnels and chambers that formed the volcano's interior, a three-dimensional map projected through the crystal light. Sarah stared at the projected map, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The network of tunnels appeared as glowing blue lines, with their current position marked by a pulsing red light. She could trace their path from the surface, through the labyrinth of lava tubes, to this hidden chamber deep within the volcano's core. It's showing us the way out, she breathed, pointing to a path that led upward through a series of chambers they hadn't yet explored. Jack limped closer, his pain momentarily forgotten. How is this possible? Ancient technology, Leo said, his voice filled with wonder. My people's stories spoke of ancestors who could speak to the mountain, but I never imagined. Clara moved cautiously around the edge of the platform, her medical training making her wary of the unknown. Whatever this is, it's responding to us, to our presence. The map shifted suddenly, zooming in on their location. New pathways appeared, branching outward from the crystal chamber. One path glowed brighter than the others, pulsing with an inviting light. I think it's trying to guide us, Sarah said, stepping closer to examine the illuminated route. The pathway led through a series of chambers she hadn't noticed before, eventually connecting to a tunnel that appeared to reach the surface on the volcano's far side. Leo nodded slowly. The mountain chooses who passes through, who it saves. Another tremor shook the chamber, stronger than before. Small crystals detached from the ceiling, shattering on the floor around them. The map flickered momentarily before stabilizing again. We don't have much time, Sarah said, memorizing the route as best she could. The eruption is intensifying. If these tunnels collapse, then we follow the path, Leo interrupted, pointing to the glowing root. "Trust the mountain." Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding. Science had brought them this far, but something beyond her understanding was offering them salvation now. "Let's go." Sarah studied the pulsing map, her eyes tracing the glowing route that promised escape. The pathway curved downward before angling sharply up, passing through what appeared to be a large horizontal chamber, unlike any they'd encountered. "There's something here," she said, pointing to the anomaly. "This chamber, it's different." Leo leaned closer, his expression shifting from reverence to concern. "Water," he said simply, "an underground river." The map flickered as another tremor shook the chamber, stronger than before. Several crystals shattered, their light extinguished in an instant. "The only way out is through that river," Sarah realized, her stomach tightening. "We'll have to swim." Jack's face paled beneath the layer of grime and ash. "Swim? Through what? Magma-heated water in the heart of an erupting volcano?" His voice cracked. "We'll be boiled alive." Clara placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Not necessarily. Underground rivers can be surprisingly cool, even in volcanic systems." Her medical training couldn't hide the uncertainty in her eyes. "But the current could be dangerous." The map flickered again, this time showing a series of red patches along their route, areas of instability that pulsed with warning. "The path to the river is collapsing," Sarah said, memorizing the danger zones. "We need to move now." They left the crystal chamber, following the route burned into Sarah's memory. The tunnel narrowed immediately, forcing them to proceed in single file. Leo led, with Jack behind him, followed by Clara and Sarah bringing up the rear. The ground beneath them had changed. No longer solid stone, but a mixture of volcanic ash and loose scoria that shifted treacherously underfoot. Each step sent small avalanches of material cascading down the sloping path. "Step exactly where I step," Leo called back, testing each foothold before committing his weight. A violent tremor shook the tunnel, sending a shower of rocks down from above. Sarah ducked, covering her head as debris rained around her. When she looked up, she saw a crack forming along the tunnel wall, widening with each passing second. "Move faster," she urged, the scientist in her calculating how quickly the passage might collapse. Jack stumbled, his injured leg giving way on the unstable ground. Clara lunged forward, catching him before he could fall. "I've got you," she said, her voice strained with effort. The tunnel floor dropped away suddenly, revealing a narrow ledge that hugged the wall above a dizzying drop. Below, in the darkness, Sarah could hear the rush of water, their destination, and their only hope of escape. Leo guided them along the narrow ledge, his movements precise despite the tremors that continued to shake the volcano. Sarah watched his every step, trying to ignore the churning void beneath them. The rush of water grew louder as they inched forward, the sound both promising and threatening. "The ledge widens ahead," Leo called back, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the volcano and the roar of unseen water. Jack's breathing had become labored, each step a battle against pain and exhaustion. Clara supported him, her own strength clearly fading. Sarah could see the tremor in Clara's hands as she gripped Jack's waist, but determination kept her moving forward. "We're almost there," Sarah encouraged, though she had no way of knowing if that was true. The ledge curved sharply, and suddenly the underground river came into view. It wasn't what Sarah had expected. Instead of a narrow channel, they faced a vast subterranean lake that filled the chamber below, its black surface reflecting the faint glow from crystalline formations embedded in the ceiling. At the far end, the water disappeared into a tunnel, their only way forward. "How are we supposed to cross that?" Jack asked, his voice hollow with despair. Leo pointed to where the ledge descended to meet the water's edge. "We swim." Sarah studied the lake, her scientific mind assessing the danger. The water's surface steamed slightly. Warm, but not boiling. More concerning was the current she could detect, flowing steadily toward the tunnel exit. "The water's moving fast," she warned. "Once we're in, there's no fighting that current." Clara helped Jack to the water's edge, where the ledge finally widened enough for them to stand comfortably. She dipped her fingers into the lake, testing the temperature. "It's bearable," she reported. But Jack's leg, another violent tremor interrupted her, larger than any before. Chunks of the ceiling crashed into the lake, sending waves across the surface. The ledge beneath their feet cracked, a fissure spreading rapidly toward them. "No choice now," Leo said, already removing his pack and securing it tightly to his body. "The mountain has decided for us." Sarah clutched the wall as the ledge beneath her feet crumbled away, sending fragments of rock tumbling into the dark water below. The heat pressed against her skin like a physical force, making each breath a struggle. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes and blurring her vision. "We need to move faster!" she shouted over the roar of the volcano. The narrow passage twisted sharply to the left, forcing them to edge sideways along a section barely wide enough for their feet. Beneath them, through cracks in the floor, Sarah glimpsed the hellish glow of molten lava churning in hidden chambers. The bubbling sound echoed through the cavern, drowning out even their labored breathing. Clara stumbled ahead of her, one hand supporting Jack while the other felt blindly along the wall. "The heat's getting worse," she called back, her voice barely audible. "Jack can't take much more of this." Sarah watched Jack's face contort with pain as he dragged his injured leg forward. His skin had taken on an alarming gray pallor, and his shirt was soaked through with sweat. A violent tremor shook the tunnel, and part of the ceiling collapsed just yards ahead of them. Leo dove forward, narrowly avoiding being crushed by falling rock. "The whole system is coming down!" Leo shouted, scrambling to his feet. "We have minutes, not hours." The temperature spiked suddenly, and Sarah felt the soles of her boots beginning to soften against the superheated floor. The air burned her lungs with each inhalation, thick with sulfur and ash. Then, as they rounded another bend, she saw it. The underground river, far wider and more turbulent than she'd expected. It surged through the cavern like a living thing, its surface steaming where it passed close to magma channels. The roar of the water competed with the volcano's rumbling, creating a deafening cacophony that made communication nearly impossible. "There," Sarah pointed, spotting a small ledge that extended to the water's edge. "That's our way out." Sarah's heart pounded as she assessed the situation. The ledge to the river was their only chance, but the path to reach it looked treacherous. "We need to cross single file," she shouted over the volcano's rumble. "The rock won't hold all of us at once." Jack leaned heavily against Clara, his face contorted with pain. "I can't make that jump at the end," he said, gesturing to the gap between the ledge and the riverbank. Sarah locked eyes with him. "You have to." Another violent tremor rocked the cavern, sending a shower of rocks plummeting into the churning water. The heat intensified, making Sarah's lungs burn with each breath. Time was running out. "I'll go first," she decided, stepping forward. "Test the path." The narrow ledge crumbled slightly under her weight, but held. Sarah inched forward, pressing her back against the wall, feeling the scorching heat through her shirt. The roar of the underground river grew louder as she approached, its dark waters promising either salvation or death. Behind her, Clara helped Jack forward while constantly glancing back at the tunnel they'd just traversed. The glow from deeper in the volcano was intensifying, casting long, distorted shadows across the cavern walls. "Sarah, hurry," Clara called out, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "The tunnel's collapsing!" Sarah reached the end of the ledge and turned back to wave them forward. The gap to the riverbank wasn't wide, maybe 4 feet. But with Jack's injury, it might as well have been a mile. "We'll make it," she said, more to herself than anyone else. She took a deep breath and leapt across the gap, landing hard on the other side. The bank was solid, leading to what appeared to be a wider cavern where the river disappeared into darkness. "Clara, you're next," Sarah called. "Then help me get Jack across." Clara nodded, carefully maneuvering around Jack and making her way along the ledge. Another tremor shook the cavern, longer and more violent than before. A massive crack split the ceiling above them, and Sarah watched in horror as the rock began to give way. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Clara inch across the ledge. The younger woman's face was tight with concentration, her movements precise despite her exhaustion. When Clara finally reached the gap, she leapt across, stumbling into Sarah's arms. "Jack, you're next!" Sarah called out, reaching her hand toward him. Jack stood frozen at the beginning of the ledge, his injured leg trembling beneath him. "I can't." "I've got you," Leo said, moving behind Jack to support him, one step at a time. The volcano gave a deafening roar, and the cavern shuddered violently. Massive chunks of rock crashed down around them, splashing into the river and sending waves of scalding water into the air. "We need to move now!" Sarah screamed over the chaos. Jack began to edge forward with Leo's help, his face contorted in agony with each step. They were halfway across when the ledge beneath them cracked, tilting precariously. "Jump!" Sarah and Clara shouted in unison, reaching out their hands. With Leo's help, Jack launched himself across the gap, crashing into the women. The 3 of them tumbled backward onto the riverbank as the ledge completely gave way behind them. "Leo!" Sarah screamed, scrambling to her feet. Leo stood alone on the other side, separated by the now impassable chasm. His face was calm, resolute. "The tunnel to the river's exit is just ahead," he called to them, pointing downstream. "Follow it out." A tremendous explosion rocked the cavern, and an avalanche of boulders crashed down, blocking the path ahead of them. "No!" Clara cried, staring at the wall of debris that now stood between them and freedom. Leo's eyes met Sarah's across the divide. "Get them out of here," he said. "I'll clear the path." "Leo, don't!" Sarah began, but he was already moving, scaling the rock pile with determined efficiency. "There's no time to argue," Leo shouted back, dislodging the first boulder. "The whole place is coming down." Sarah watched in horror as Leo worked feverishly, shifting rocks and creating a small opening near the top of the pile. Behind him, magma began to seep through cracks in the floor. "Go!" Leo commanded as the opening became just wide enough for them to squeeze through. "Now!" "We can't leave you!" Clara cried. Leo looked at them one last time, his face illuminated by the hellish glow of approaching magma. "You have to. Live for me." Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked with Leo's across the widening chasm. The magma's glow cast his face in harsh relief, highlighting the determination in his eyes and the acceptance of what was to come. Her throat closed up, words failing her as the reality of his sacrifice hit home. "Go!" Leo shouted again, his voice barely audible over the volcano's roar. "The river is your only chance." Clara tugged at Sarah's arm, tears streaming down her ash-covered face. "Sarah, please, we can't let him die for nothing." The words cut through Sarah's paralysis. She grabbed Jack's arm, helping Clara support his weight as they scrambled toward the small opening Leo had created. The heat was becoming unbearable, the air so thick with sulfur and ash that each breath felt like swallowing fire. "Through here," Sarah directed, pushing Jack towards the opening first. He hesitated, looking back at Leo, then dragged himself through with a grunt of pain. Clara went next, her small frame slipping easily through the gap. She reached back to help Sarah, who took one last look at Leo. He stood amid falling rocks and encroaching magma and raised his hand in a final salute. Sarah forced herself through the opening, feeling the sharp edges of rock tear at her clothing and skin. On the other side, the river stretched before them, its dark waters flowing into a tunnel that promised escape from the volcano's fury. "We need to get into the water," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "It's our only way out now." Jack stared at the churning current. "How do we know where it leads?" "We don't," Sarah admitted. Behind them, the rock pile shifted ominously as pressure built on the other side. "But Leo gave us this chance. We take it or we die here." Clara helped Jack to the water's edge, her movements mechanical, her eyes vacant with shock and exhaustion. "He knew, didn't he, that someone would have to stay behind?" Sarah couldn't answer. The weight of Leo's sacrifice pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Had she led them all to this? Had she known, somewhere deep down, that the price of their escape would be so high? The river swept them along its dark course, tumbling them through narrow passages where the water rushed with terrifying speed. Sarah fought to keep her head above the surface, catching glimpses of Clara and Jack nearby as they were carried deeper into the volcano's labyrinthine tunnels. The roar behind them grew to a deafening crescendo, Leo's final gift giving them the precious minutes they needed. Sarah's chest tightened with grief even as she struggled against the current. The water temperature dropped suddenly as they rounded a bend, the scorching heat of the volcano's heart giving way to cooler air that stung their lungs. "Light!" Clara shouted, pointing ahead where a faint grayish glow broke through the darkness. The river widened, its pace slowing enough for Sarah to gain control of her movements. She swam toward Jack, who was struggling to stay afloat with his injured leg. "Almost there," she gasped, helping him navigate toward the growing light. The tunnel opened abruptly, spilling them into open air. They tumbled over a small waterfall into a pool at the base of the volcano's outer slope. Above them, the sky was choked with ash and smoke, but it was sky nonetheless. Sarah dragged herself onto the rocky shore, every muscle screaming in protest. Clara helped Jack from the water, collapsing beside him on the ground. For several minutes, they could only lie there, gulping in the relatively fresh air, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. "We made it," Jack whispered, his voice raw. Sarah pushed herself up, scanning their surroundings. They were on the opposite side of the island from where they'd started, the volcano looming behind them, belching smoke and ash into the atmosphere. In the distance, she heard something, a rhythmic thumping that cut through the volcano's rumble. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Clara lifted her head, listening. "Helicopter." As if summoned by their recognition, a rescue helicopter appeared through the ash cloud, its searchlight sweeping the terrain. Sarah scrambled to her feet, waving her arms frantically above her head. The helicopter spotted them, hovering momentarily before finding a clear spot to land nearby. Medical personnel rushed out, quickly assessing their conditions and helping them aboard. Sarah watched the helicopter's blades slice through the ash-filled air as they lifted off from the volcano's slope. Her body sank into the seat, muscles surrendering to exhaustion now that survival was no longer in question. The medical officer pressed an oxygen mask to her face, and the clean air burned her smoke-damaged lungs. Through the helicopter's window, she caught a final glimpse of the volcano, its peak now partially collapsed, rivers of lava carving fiery paths down its sides. Somewhere in that inferno was Leo. The thought stabbed through her chest with physical pain. Beside her, Clara held Jack's hand as another medic tended to his injured leg. Clara's face was a mask of exhaustion, her eyes hollow. When she caught Sarah looking at her, She attempted a smile that never reached her eyes. "He knew what he was doing," Clara said, her voice barely audible over the helicopter's roar. "Leo chose to save us." Sarah nodded, unable to form words around the lump in her throat. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier. She had led them into the volcano, and Leo had paid the ultimate price to get them out. Jack winced as the medic wrapped his leg. "The research," he said suddenly. "Did anyone grab the data?" Sarah patted her pocket where she'd stashed the small waterproof case containing their findings, the crystalline samples and her notes about the ancient markings. It seemed insignificant now, measured against Leo's life, yet it was what he would have wanted them to preserve. "We have it," she confirmed. "Leo's sacrifice won't be for nothing." The helicopter banked sharply, heading toward the main island where emergency services awaited. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the vibrations of the aircraft through her battered body. Images flashed behind her eyelids. Leo's final salute, the river's dark waters, the ancient chamber with its glowing crystals. "What will you do now?" Clara asked softly. Sarah opened her eyes, meeting Clara's gaze. "Complete our work," she said. "Tell the world what we found, what Leo helped us discover."